Hello and welcome to our second hands-on video covering CloudFormation. This time we're going to launch a stack that's more complicated, that has a number of different resources in it. We're going to launch a stack based on a template which creates a VPC environment, including a public subnet and an internet gateway, routing table, security group rule. We're going to launch a single EC2 instance into that VPC, into a subnet of that VPC, and that EC2 instance will be associated with a security group, and it will also be associated with an instance role, which will allow access via AWS Session Manager. So a lot of different things happening in this template. Obviously, it's more complex than the previous template that we saw, but still not really not as complex as many of the templates that you might work with in your organization. I've worked with templates that are thousands of lines long. And so compared to that, this template is still relatively simple. Well, let's take a look at the template code. And in this case, again, we have our AWS template format version at the top. We have a parameters section now where we are defining a one parameter called instance type. It's a string parameter, and it has a default value of T2 micro. It's allowing two values, T2 micro and T2 medium. And we will use this parameter to define the instance type of the EC2 instance that is launched by the CloudFormation stack. We have the resources section where we have a number of resources defined. We have a VPC called class VPC, and we have a couple different properties that we've enabled. We're defining the network block, which is 10.0.0.0/16, and we have that VPC is partitioned into a public subnet, and that subnet has a network block of 10.0.0.0/24. We also have a security group that we're defining, and the security group is associated with the class VPC. You can see, just like the public subnet, there is a property called VPC ID, and it is referencing, using that ref intrinsic function, it's referencing the class VPC resource. And this is how we can associate resources with one another. It's how we sort of wire together resources in a CloudFormation template. And this security group has a security group ingress rule defined, which is allowing incoming TCP access on port 80 from anywhere on the internet, which is that 0.0.0.0/0 syntax. We have an internet gateway that we're defining, and then we also have a second resource called a gateway, a VPC gateway attachment resource. And the gateway attachment resource is what associates this internet gateway with our VPC. You can see there are two properties here on the gateway attachment. The first one is referencing the internet gateway resource, and the second one is referencing the class VPC resource. And you might be thinking, well, that seems strange. Why can't we just reference the VPC on the internet gateway resource? And well, that's how AWS has designed it. But also, if you remember, when you manually created the internet gateway in the past, you had to create the gateway and then you had to associate it with a VPC. So there were really two steps involved. And so that's also reflected in the CloudFormation template in the form of two separate resources. We have a couple other resources that are associated with our public subnet. For example, we have a public routing table that we're creating, and then we have defined a single route on that routing table, and the route here is routing a route out to the internet through the internet gateway. So we're referencing the internet gateway, and it's routing out to the internet as the destination. And then we associate that routing table. So we create that routing table, and we have to associate it with the subnet ID. So you see there's two properties here for this subnet route table association resource. We have the route table ID, and then we have the subnet ID, and that's what wires the two together. We have a class, we have an Iam role called class server role, and this Iam role is a role which will allow AWS Session Manager access to the EC2 instance. You can see we create the role, and then we associate that role here with an instance profile. And that instance profile resource is then associated with our EC2 instance, which is below. And that EC2 instance has a logical name of class web server. The instance type, you can see we are referencing the instance type parameter that we passed in. We have the image ID. In this case, the image ID is hard-coded, but really what we'd like to see generally is something like the image ID is specified either in a mapping or it's passed in as a parameter value. We have the subnet ID here, which we're referencing that public subnet resource that we created, and then the IAM instance profile is referencing the class instance profile that we created above. We have security group IDs that we're defining. You have to provide a list of security groups that an EC2 instance is associated with. And because an EC2 instance, of course, can be associated with more than one security group. In this case, there is only one. And so we provide a list, and there's only one member in the list, which is the web server security group resource that we created earlier. And then finally, there is an outputs section here, and we have an output key called web URL, and that is going to output a website address because we're launching a web server. And it's going to create that website address by getting the public IP address associated with the web server that we're launching, which is this get attribute function, which is the value that this get attribute function is returning. And then we're using the join function here, and we're going to concatenate this http:// with that public IP address to create something that looks like more like a standard URL. Okay, well, I think we've reviewed the template here. So let's go into our CloudFormation dashboard, and we're going to create a new stack, and we're going to use the S3 bucket location of our template. Click on next. We're going to provide a stack name. I'm just going to call it my stack again. And then here's where we can specify the values for any input parameters that are defined in our stack. And we only have one input parameter called instance type. And you can see that it limits me to either T2 micro or T2 medium, which is what's specified in the template. So we're going to leave it at the T2 micro instance type. Click on next. And we'll just accept all the defaults here. Click on next again. Scroll down. And when we scroll down, it's under the capabilities section. It's asking us to acknowledge the fact that the CloudFormation stack may create IAM resources, which it will because it's creating an IAM role. And so that's fine. We want to acknowledge that it's going to do that. And we can then click on the Create Stack button. And now our stack creation is in progress. If I click on refresh, then you see a bunch of other events pop up. And CloudFormation is going to create all of the different resources in this stack. You see it's working on creating these resources. And if I click on refresh, some of them have already been completed. And so it's going to list out all of the different resources it's creating and its progress while creating those resources. Now, if there were to be some sort of like error message or failure, you would see it here in this events list, and you would be able to actually look under the status reason column and see the specific error message that is associated with the failure. And that error message is what you would use to try to troubleshoot what is happening with the template. Sometimes, especially when you're beginning and starting to work with CloudFormation, it can be difficult to understand why things are failing. And it might take some internet searches and staring at code and trying different things to try to figure out what is going on. And that's true when you're working with any new technology, right? Initially, you might struggle to figure out how to troubleshoot issues, but over time, with practice, then you get better and better at troubleshooting CloudFormation deployment problems. And I'll click on the resources tab again. You can see we got most of the resources that are in place. There are a few resources which will take a little extra time. It's got to launch an Ec2 instance, which will take a minute or so. If I go under stack info, you can see that my stack is still being created. So it says create in progress. I click on the template. You can see here's the full template that I have specified and that it's creating. If I click in the parameters section, it gives me a list of parameters that are set along with the value of those parameters. Those things are all expected. And so here you can see now we're creating the web server, the Ec2 instance, create in progress. That's kind of the last remaining item that we need to create. And I'm just going to pause it here and wait another minute while it creates that resource. Okay, the stack is done creating all of the resources. Now, if I go to the Outputs tab, you will see that there's my web URL output key, and it has a value associated with it. This is the public IP address of the web server. And we've concatenated this HTTP string to the front of it. If I just open that in a new window, then you'll see I get my response. This is the response back from the web server. It's showing me the instance ID of the system. So the Ec2 instance was successfully launched, and it has, and it's responding properly to us. Now, I just want to show you, if I go to the Ec2 dashboard, that you will see here's my Ec2 instance called class web server. This was created by CloudFormation along with the VPC and subnet and internet gateway. Everything, all those resources were created by CloudFormation. And so if I want to clean up that stack, if I want to delete it, I can just select it and say delete, and it's saying, are you sure you want to delete my stack? Yes, I do. Why don't you go ahead and delete it? And now CloudFormation will go ahead and clean up that stack and all the resources in it. So you can see it shows delete in progress. It knows how to properly clean up the stack for me, which is absolutely fantastic. If you know the pain of having to manually create these resources and then having to manually figure out how to delete and clean up all these resources, CloudFormation will do that automatically for you. So you could take this template and give it to 10 other people in your organization, and they could all launch the same set of resources for development or testing purposes or whatever. And then when they're done, they can just delete the stack, and all of these resources will be cleaned up for you. Well, I hope you enjoyed the second hands-on segment. It was a little bit more complex than the first one, so just showing you more of the capabilities and the advantages of using CloudFormation and infrastructure as code to manage the infrastructure in your organization.